So thank you everyone for joining. We're very, very excited to be presenting this webinar today. I'll let Louise maybe introduce a bit about why we've organized this webinar. But first, why don't we just do a little bit of introductions. I'll start with myself. My name is Nicole Tunstall. I'm Vice President at International Market Access Consulting, which is a boutique firm working both in Switzerland and in North America. And I've been in the industry for a little over 15 years. I started in medical communications or medical writing. And since working in market access over the last 10, 15 years, I've worn many different hats. And now working as Vice President at IMAC, facilitating projects, working with clients, and really enjoying our efforts to get approvals for different therapies in different markets. So I'll pass it over to Louise.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Good afternoon to some people, good morning to others, depending on in what time zone you are. This is really exciting. We're really excited to talk about the JCA today because one of the reasons we're talking about it's because it's going to start very soon. Actually, it's already started. But we should get some outcome of the JCA early in 2025. So this is something that concerns many biotech and pharmaceutical companies and everybody in many of the line functions in the different companies. So we're really excited to talk about that. I am the CEO and founder of IMAC. I've been in the industry forever. I'm not even telling how many years. I've been in many, many different roles, from sales to pricing, clinical research, government affairs, and so on and so forth. And well, I won't steal my punch of the next slide, so I will just stop there and turn it back to you, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Louise. So just a couple technical notes. I'd like to encourage everyone to interact on the question and answer forum. You can send questions or comments there, and we will have a question period at the end of the session. And also just to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be available a few days after the session. So please keep an eye on our LinkedIn for notification of that, and it'll be uploaded so you can rewatch it if you missed anything or forward it to any of your colleagues that might not have been able to attend. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Louise to start the presentation.
Thank you, Nicole. So just very quickly about IMAC. IMAC was founded 18 years ago already, in 2006 in Zug, Switzerland. And since then, it's been established in North America since 2010. So we are a boutique firm with a global reach. Over the years, we have refined our expertise in supporting the entire life product cycle, from early planning stages to post-launch strategies. Today's focus is part of our continuous efforts to provide clients with tailored strategic support in navigating, to say the least, complex regulatory environment. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with okay. So at IMAC, our approach is built around supporting clients through the entire product lifecycle, as mentioned. We engage early at the demand of our clients, helping companies define patients' populations and outcomes that matter to reimbursement agencies. Specifically during phase 1, we focus on landscape analysis and defining standard care by working closely with key opinion leaders. As we progress into phase 2 and 3, we adapt and refine strategies through living systematic literature reviews and interactive electronic global value dossiers, among other things. Overcommitment Our commitment to clients is really straightforward. It's to offer tailored strategies that are not only compliant with the regulatory requirements, but are also anticipating the challenges and expectations of the HTA bodies, the health technology assessment bodies. By leveraging our decades of experience, our innovative economic models, and strong relationships with global and local stakeholders, we ensure that every step from clinical development to market entry is strategically optimized for success. Our team is focused on completing projects successfully, of course, faster, cheaper, and better. Faster because our proactive planning and early alignment with regulatory guidelines ensure accelerated timelines for submission to approval, enabling faster market entry. Cheaper due to our flexible model, which allows clients to scale up or down a highly specialized team of resources on project needs. Better, which our clients claim is due to our strategic approach, which incorporates deep regulatory insights and local expertise, leading to well-informed decisions and comprehensive submissions. Now let's shift our focus to a crucial aspect of market access strategy that aligns with IMAC's mission. The EU Joint Clinical Assessment, of course, this is very new. This is, well, actually, it's been talked about for many years now, and it's been studied by EU NETA. And just as a brief overview, the EU JCA was established by the regulation 2021-2282, which came into force on May 23rd of this year, 2024. So, and really, we see it sometimes, but not sometimes, but probably most often than we should. We see it as a roadblock. However, the purpose of the EU JCA is to support increased efficiencies and time to access for new therapies. The EU JCA will be implemented in 3 steps. On January 12, 2025, which is right around the corner, new oncology and ATMP therapies will be reviewed. And then 3 years later, in 28, this will be expanded to include orphan drugs. And finally, in 2030, it will include all new therapies in Europe. Each country will continue to maintain its own HTA review, as the GCA scope is only clinical. It has nothing to do with economics, so no economic model, no budget impact assessment. However, it's important to anticipate that the results of the clinical review of the GCA will likely have an impact on the economic assessment conducted at the member state level. This slide shows the process for EMEA and GCA in parallel. The submission to GCA must be submitted around the same time as the EMEA submission to ensure the results of the GCA assessment are available very soon after EMEA approval. As part of the initial pre-submission phase to the GCA, the draft SmPC and other supporting evidence will need to be provided by the health technology developer, the HTD, and this is probably approximately 6 months prior to the regulatory submission to the EMEA, the regulatory submission to EMEA. So 6 months prior to that, the GCA process initiates. The draft SmPC, the clinical trial data, and other supporting evidence that the health technology developer agrees to share with the JCA will be used by the JCA to prepare its assessment. And the first component of this assessment is the development of the PICO. Member states will be surveyed to identify their regional PICOs, and those regional PICOs will be fed back to the JCA, and then the JCA will finalize the PICO scope. Here, I just want to open a parenthesis to highlight how EMA and JCA will look at the SmPC or any other evidence that's provided on a new therapy. And it's important to understand that these two agencies ask different questions. We know EMA is concerned with efficacy, safety, and the quality of the product manufactured. On the other hand, JCA is concerned with clinical effectiveness and safety. So essentially, the two bodies are looking at the same technology and the same evidence, but from different angles. So let's take the approach of the EMA as an example. One of the questions that is obviously asked by EMA is the new treatment efficacious? And to answer this question, the health technology developer designed this very sophisticated clinical trial, including a very specific patient population. The health technology development team came up with very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that they enroll the right patients in the study in order to answer the question on efficacy. On the other hand, the question asked by JCA will be, is the new treatment effective compared to current clinical practice? Now, this question is extremely loaded one when you try to answer it based on evidence from the clinical trial. Essentially, part of what this question means is, what type of patients will receive the new therapy in the real world environment? Meaning, will the actual patients treated with the new therapy in the real world be similar to those enrolled in the clinical trial? And if there is a difference, what is that difference? And how does this impact the efficacy outcome that was measured in the very controlled environment called a clinical trial? Now, another question that JCA may ask is, what are the comparators of the new therapy in the real world? Are the comparators the same as the ones included in the clinical trial designed for EMA approval? If not, what can you say about comparative effectiveness of the new therapy? So, okay, let's close this parenthesis and let's go back to our main topic, which is the first task of JCA being to establish the PICO framework for new therapy, which in turn will be the foundation for the JCA assessment. So as a brief refresher, the PICO is a framework used to formulate clinical research questions and to guide assessment of clinical evidence. It stands for, the P stands for patient, the I for intervention, which is the new therapy. The C stands for comparator, and O for outcome. The summary of product characteristics, the SmPC, is a key regulatory document that establishes the position of the new therapy, and it's also the basis of information that a healthcare professional will require on the use of the drug. So it is essential. It is an essential part of the marketing authorization dossier submitted to EMA. And it's also submitted to national competent authorities like in the UK now. So the SmPC defines the product's therapeutic indication, the dosing, and patient populations, which sets the boundaries for what is assessed in the JCA. There's a lot more information that goes into the SmPC, and obviously this information is based on the results of the clinical trials, the phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. There are a total of 10 sections to an SmPC, but we identified 2 sections that are likely to play a key role in the PICO assessment, Section 4 and Section 5, and we'll discuss these in more details in the next few slides. So specifically, sections 4.1, 4.2, and 5.1 will play a role in the PICO assessment. Section 4.1 will help define the population, the intervention, and the comparator, as mentioned before. Section 4.2 is the posology and the method of administration, which can provide some insight on the intervention through nuances of dosage and any healthcare resources required to administer therapy. Section 5.1 is the pharmacodynamic section, and it will provide insight about the mechanism of action and potential clinical information that can define the comparators. Additionally, this section can further define the patient population depending on the product and the therapy. In the next slides, we will discuss each section in details and give some examples. Section 4.1 is the most important section that defines, again, the therapeutic indication and comparators, and it has 4 main sections to it. The target disease, which may include a particular disease type that's been studied, like a specific mutation, as an example. Section 4.1 also defines the target population and potential subgroups, if applicable. The place in therapy is also defined in this section, and this is particularly important in oncology, which has multiple lines of therapy. The place in therapy may also vary by jurisdiction, so this is where we get into an obvious place where jurisdiction may have each different PICOs. Section 4.1 may also expand if a therapy is combo or monotherapy, particularly if a drug is administered in combination with another therapy, or with a specific class of drug or a specific drug. All right, enough of my voice. Let's mix things up a little bit. I'm going to hand things over to Nicole now to deep dive into the examples we have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. So I just requested control of the screen so that I'll move the slides forward.
I don't see your request.
I'm not able to press it again, unfortunately. So if you can't see it, then maybe move them forward for me.
Yeah, I do that.
Perfect. Yeah. So we'll go to the next slide. So hang on, let me just try one more time because I'll just try one more time and see if it pops up for you this time. No?
No, I don't see it.
We'll just go ahead with you. I'll just ask you to move them forward when I need to.
Sure.
Thanks. So as Louise mentioned, and as we all know, the JCA process hasn't officially launched yet, But in the preparation period leading up to the official launch in 2025, there have been some pilot projects run by the European Network for Health Technology Assessment, or EUNETA, where they assessed some medicinal products. And we're going to use some of these examples to help illustrate what Louise was speaking about earlier in the webinar. Now, these pilot projects were really helpful to fine-tune the JCA process, improving methodology and boosting collaboration with the HTA bodies in the EU. So they are very important to look at because they should be able to help teach us a little bit more about what might be expected starting in January. So one of the products reviewed during this pilot period was venetoclax, and that pilot review took place in 2021. And venetoclax also went through health technology assessments in Germany and France. So as per the SmPC, venetoclax is indicated for use in combination with a hypomethylating agent for patients newly diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And it should be noted, and this will be a little important in a minute, it should be noted that the clinical studies were specifically done in combination with azacitidine. So in the pilot assessment that EUNETA did, they identified that venetoclax could be prescribed in combination with azacitidine, decitabine, LDAC, and glastigib as comparators. Now, so that was the EUNETA report, and it was an example of a kind of European report. Now, when venetoclax went through assessment by Germany, Germany acknowledged the limitation of the clinical data, but indicated that since venetoclax could also be used in combination with decitabine. So there we already see a difference between those two assessments. EUNETA identified quite a few. However, Germany indicated that it would be azacitidine and decitabine. On the other hand, France didn't follow the same path and restricted venetoclax to only being used in combination with azacitidine, citing the clinical limitations of the primary clinical trial. So this example really highlights the complexities and variations that we can see in therapeutic approaches in different countries. While the EU JCA process moves forward, the lessons that we learn from these pilot assessments will be essential to help us shape an effective and collaborative methodologies for HTA processes throughout the EU. As you can see in this particular case, the EUNETA assessment, which was in some, not completely, but in some ways mimicking what we would see later with the EU JCA, was different than what ended up being approved in Germany and in France. We can go to the next slide, please. So we'll move on to ATMPs, or Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products. Now, none of these have been assessed as pilot projects by EUNETA. However, given the high cost and complex implementation associated with these types of therapies, it's likely that reimbursement will vary across the EU member states and may be heavily influenced by each country's cost and resource constraints. So we wanted to look at an example of this, even though it hasn't been assessed by a pilot EUNETA assessment. So we're looking at Tecartus, CAR T therapy, which is indicated for mantle cell lymphoma. So the SmPC indication is that Tecartus should be administered to patients who have failed 2 or more lines of therapy. However, we've already seen some variation in how this guidance is interpreted at the HTA level. In Finland, for instance, Tecartus can be given after ibrutinib therapy, which that itself is administered after failure on 3 previous treatments. So that places Tecartus as a 4th-line treatment, and that is not aligned with the SmPC. Meanwhile, the French authority, which we spoke about in the earlier slide, has recommended Tecartus in line with its original indication of the SmPC, meaning that it can be used as a 3rd-line treatment following failure in two therapies. And these differences that we see at the EU member state level highlights a broader issue for ATMP specifically. for high-cost, complex interventions, the variation in assessment and reimbursement criteria across countries will not be uncommon. I mean, I think we've all experienced that already over the last few years that they've been coming to market. But in this case, the reason why we wanted to highlight this example is that these discrepancies will have a significant impact on the PICO, as Louise mentioned before, the Population Intervention Comparator and Outcome Assessment Framework that the EU JCA will use. And there will be an important collaboration between the EU member states and the EU JCA in order to assure that the PICO that are defined for the EU JCA take into account all of the clinical practice in each of the EU member states. Now, for some therapies, this could, especially for oncology therapies, this could become quite complicated. And essentially, it really underscores the need to prepare early, of course, for defining these PICO and to be adaptable in order to account for national context at the national level, at the member state level. So we can move to the next slide, please. So just to wrap up this section, it's essential for health technology developers to ensure that the therapeutic indication in the SmPC aligns well within the SmPC and the JCA, and that it will eventually align with the national HTA reviews down the road in order to streamline access to the therapies for patients. When a therapeutic indication is quite specific, the definitions of population and intervention tend to be clear and consistent across different jurisdictions. And this uniformity will likely lead to a more straightforward JCA process. However, when there is variability in the indication, this can lead to multiple PICO assessments being developed by the JCA, which may complicate the review process. Broader indications may be advantageous to a health technology developer, of course, because it allows access to a larger potential market. But this may also prompt decision makers to seek ways to narrow the target population, which could affect the PICO assessment. And in such cases, it's really up to the developer or the JCA to set the appropriate limitations. But the key here is that proactive planning is needed in order to navigate the complexity of the JCA appropriately or successfully. Health technology developers need to anticipate and prepare for various scenarios and understand how the PICOs may be shaped based on the different parts of the SmPC, as we're mentioning here, and taking into consideration clinical practice across the EU member states. We can move to the next slide. So here we'll just quickly go over, as Louise mentioned before, the different sections of the SmPC that are relevant to our discussion today are 4.1, 4.2, and 5.2. So looking at 4.2 specifically, this section of the SmPC looks at posology and method of administration. And this section can help refine the intervention section of the PICO. And we'll go into a couple examples again that will help elucidate what we mean by that. And you can move to the next slide, please. Thanks, Louise. Thank you. So the first example that we'll look at is Durismo, which underwent a UNEDA pilot review in 2020, so quite a few years ago now. However, we wanted to highlight this example because an interesting issue arose with the dosing guidance. In the SmPC for Durismo, the recommendation was that the therapy should continue as long as the patient was deriving benefit, but no specific duration was defined. However, when the UNEDA pilot report was published, it acknowledged this lack of clarity, and in the end agreed patients should receive the therapy until they're no longer benefiting. When the therapy underwent review with the German authorities, they took a different approach. They assumed a 1-year duration in the absence of a defined guidance. And this assumption introduces downstream implications, particularly for economic assessments. And now, acknowledging that economics are not a component of the EU JCA directly, National HTA bodies, of course, will look to JCA reviews as part of their full HTA process, which likely considers an economic analysis as well. This means that JCA as a review, even indirectly, may influence the economic dimension of a country's HTA assessment. And it's crucial that the evidence supporting the therapy includes robust data on dosing duration, especially if no fixed duration is specified. This alignment in the SmPC and then in the JCA will help ensure consistency across HTA reviews and reduce the potential for economic interpretation of differences. So this example really shows us that clarity in dosing recommendations is essential. And this we'll start to see this likely coming up in guidelines that may be influenced again through the JCA assessment as well. So here we're just highlighting all the different areas where JCA could affect change down the road. And we can move to the next slide, please. So moving back again to ATMPs, infrastructure is a crucial factor when we're considering ATMPs, infrastructure for administration of these therapies. The SmPC for Tecartus, for instance, highlights specific requirements necessary to administer the drug effectively. When Tecartus underwent a review by Haas, the French authority, they took the recommendation a step further, explicitly noting that patient eligibility for Tecartus may be affected by the availability of these resources. And this brings to light an important challenge for ATMPs, as they often require specialized infrastructure. As I mentioned before, no ATMP has gone through a pilot review by UNEDA, but it will be, because of that, it's going to be even more interesting to see how JCA approaches defining the intervention for these complex therapies, given especially when considering administration. JCA's approach to ATMPs could set important precedents, especially when it comes to assessing the feasibility of widespread implementation across different regions and healthcare settings. And this is important because ATMPs will be among the first therapies reviewed by the JCA process. So it will really be important to see how a JCA assessment may affect the suggested intervention and administration recommendations for each product, and how that might again influence the HTA bodies down the road. Okay, so we can move on just to concluding this section. So again, defining the posology and method of administration for a therapy in a way that meets the needs of the member states is essential to avoid limiting its applicability. So variability in administration, such as dosing frequency, like we saw with the first example, may lead to jurisdictional differences in how a therapy is delivered and interpreted. The JCA may opt to not specify dosing details if the evidence is strong enough to support flexibility in administration. However, in those cases, we see that then different member states can apply different restrictions on the therapy. So it's a bit of a give and take process. You might want the flexibility at the SmPC and JCA stage. However, it'll be important to plan ahead and understand how that might affect you in different regions before even maybe really even finalizing the SmPC or JCA assessment. All right, so we can move on to the last section that we'll talk about now, and that's section 5.1 of the SmPC, which provides supplementary data. It's considered additional information aiming to provide further details, but does not directly affect the intervention as described in section 4.1 of the SmPC. We'll just go through an example of what we mean by this, how this can potentially affect the JCA. So in this case, the identification, this can can influence the identification of potential comparators. And these are often found in section 5.1 of the SmPC, especially when clinical trials include a head-to-head comparison. For instance, in this example, in the Alecensa SmPC for advanced ALK positive NSCLC, crizotinib was identified as a comparator. This choice was also reflected in the UNETA pilot review, PICO, which acknowledged that the SmPC contributed to defining the comparator. And this is an important point, as these are just pilot reviews. However, the fact that they are acknowledging that the SmPC contributed to defining the comparator in this case is an important part that we need to be aware, take note of and be aware of, because these pilot projects will form the future JCA process. Additionally, in section 5.1, you may find that it clarifies the patient population. Again, maybe not changing it completely, but it might be aligning, as we saw here, aligning it with the broader ALK positive NSCLC group as indicated in the ALEX trial for Alecensa. The JCA noted that this correspondence using the SmPC as a foundational reference to refine the population within the PICO framework. So again, sorry, I didn't mean to say the JCA. I meant to say the UNETA pilot review noted this, noted the SmPC as a foundational reference. Again, important to the future JCA process that we will be seeing in January. So we can see here, I mean, these are kind of more direct examples of how this SmPC may play a critical role in guiding the JCA's PICO assessment, providing early indications of appropriate comparators and target populations. And of course, this alignment will help streamline the JCA's evaluation process as well, ensuring that clinical comparisons and patient populations are clearly defined from the outset. We can move to the next slide. Now, this slide is the last example. It doesn't actually involve a UNETA pilot review, but we wanted to include it because it involves a comparison with NICE in England. And while NICE will not be a part involved with the EU JCA directly, we use it as an example as they are quite an influential national HTA in Europe. So again, moving back to Tecartus, the CAR-T, in section 5.1 of the SmPC, it identified a patient demographic of largely over 65 years of age with 3 prior therapies. However, when Tecartus underwent review by NICE, that review noted that the population might be younger than those typically covered by the NHS. And NICE suggested that the eligibility criteria would be limited to patients matching the clinical trial criteria. So this comparison highlights the importance of the clinical trial population as defined in SmPC and the indication shaping the PICO network. Variability in patient profiles between countries can impact the applicability of the JCA review down the road. If the population criteria are too narrow, the relevance might be restricted in some EU member states. So again, in this example, we just wanted to look at how defining the patient population broadly enough to allow cross-jurisdictional relevance is essential for maximizing the JCA's applicability, and that the balance between specificity and flexibility in eligibility criteria is needed to ensure the review is both inclusive and reflective of real-world patient demographics in different countries. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So this is just a summary of the examples that I've presented already today, and just basically to say that the clinical evidence in the SmPC, while it's quite brief, and as we know, it's in a regulatory format, which is very different than what we normally see in a market access context, it is instrumental in setting the parameters for the PICO assessment in the JCA. And these data will help define the population for the PICO and validate the manufacturer's target population for both the JCA and subsequent HTA submissions. Additionally, the SmPC clinical data can assist in identifying, as we saw, relevant comparators and supporting a more comprehensive PICO definition of population, subgroups, and things like that. With the key takeaways, Louise,
Yes,
I just wanted to highlight on the next slide. We added this in just really to show everyone how much overlap there is between the JCA and the HTA assessments. So really what we're showing on this slide is some of the key components of we just used Germany, GBA, and England, NICE as examples because they're two of the most comprehensive HTA processes. But what we're really showing here is how much alignment there is between what is reported in the JCA and what is reported in the HTA assessments in different EU member states, such as Germany and England. Well, England's not one of them, but we use this as an example because it's a very comprehensive review. And as you can see, go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, sorry, Nicole, you were probably going to mention that, but this slide really shows that it is possible to start working on a JCA submission early because there's information in there that is set before the JCA assessment, and you can start working on it early. And it's also to show that companies have this JCA, yes, is a new process, but the companies have dealt with this kind of challenges before, and JCA is there, and I want to emphasize that again. It's seen as a roadblock, but you have to keep in mind this is there mainly to harmonize the HTA processes. So and this is also to show that JCA, the submission itself is not going to be a whole lot different than what we are used to seeing at the national level.
Perfect. So before we get to some of the questions that have come in, we just have one last slide. If you don't mind passing it forward, Louise. And this slide is just a little summary of how IMAC can support the JCA process. As we've talked about during this last 45 minutes, early strategic alignment is very, very important. Whether or not an SmPC, a draft SmPC is already in place, IMAC can support with either drafting or scenario planning with the SmPC if there is already one in place. And by scenario planning, the main point of this is to help develop and anticipate PICO that will be required by the JCA. And the reason for this goes back to the timeline slide that Louise shared earlier. As you know, the PICO, for the JCA process, a systematic literature review is required, and the PICO are a part of that. However, the amount of time that you have once the JCA process has started in order to complete the SLR is not enough. So it's really important to, earlier than when you submit, to start developing and anticipating the PICO that would be reviewed by JCA. And this is something that over the last year or so, I've talked to quite a few clients and different, health technology developers about. And this is the main source of concern, is how do we correctly develop and anticipate the PICO that will be required for the JCA. And so that's part of what we talk about when we say scenario planning. It's just a way to comprehensively assess across Europe what would be considered for the PICO, for the JCA process. Another aspect of IMAC, of our team that can help with the JCA assessment process is that we have a framework, a turnkey SLR framework. We have a robust framework, I should say, to develop SLRs that are easily adaptable to changes based on the final EU JCA PICO assessment. So this again highlights the importance of the unknown. While you can do all the planning in the world, you still won't know until it's finally published what the JCA PICO will be. And in that case, there might be a need to adapt your process and to continue on rapidly. And we've developed a very robust framework to do that. So without having to start from scratch and without losing any work, we're able to pivot and adapt the SLR to align with the JCA assessment. This also includes landscape assessments for key jurisdictions, and this is insight into clinical practices, reimbursement trends in different member states, especially for comparators. These are all extremely important when developing the PICO that will be assessed as part of the JCA assessment. And then, of course, last but not least, the drafting of the JCA dossier, which of course is an incredibly important part of the process. As Louise mentioned a couple slides ago, it's really important to be proactive. You don't need to wait until certain steps are complete before you start drafting the assessment. In fact, you can start as early or as you are drafting the SmPC. And that is key to the entire process, is to start early and to plan ahead. And the other key that we've tried to relay in this talk is that we want to optimize the development of the JCA for alignment with future HTA submissions, because that obviously is the next step in the market access process. Once the EU JCA assessment is complete, then the EU member states will be assessing on their own HTA bodies. And the outcome of the JCA assessment will become very important in that time. Obviously, you want an assessment that aligns with how you see your product as a developer, and you want to make sure that you're controlling any unknowns that might come out of the assessment. I don't know if I missed anything. If you wanted to add, Louise.
No, I think you have covered everything. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So we have a few questions that have come in as we were talking. Okay, so why don't we start? The first one I'll pass over to you, Louise. How would you integrate? Okay, this is a good one because, as we know, the SmPC is traditionally a regulatory document, and traditionally, market access and regulatory teams may not have as much of a collaborative relationship. So this question is, how would you integrate a market access team into the development of what has traditionally been a regulatory team document, the SmPC? And in the context of considering that the SmPC may influence the PICO for the EU JCA. Did you want to tackle that one, Louise?
Sure, I can. Thank you. That's a very good question, actually. I would be actually curious to know how market access people, how integrated they are at this point in their own organization into the SmPC development. I'm assuming that it varies quite a lot from company to company. At least when I was working in the pharma directly, but that was a couple of years ago, it wasn't very common to have the market access people involved into the wording of the SmPC. However, now we have our clients who actually, some of them are really integrated, others are not. And obviously, the idea is to have market access people integrated even before the SmPC is written, even when the clinical trials are developed and designed. I think it's definitely a game changer to involve market access people, especially considering the impact that it will have. Like I said earlier, it's not a new thing that the SmPC is important for HTA submission. It's the fact that now it's the timing with the EMA submission, the fact that you're going to submit a draft SmPC to JCA. This draft SmPC is going to be the basis for the JCA PICO framework, which will be the foundation for the assessment. So I would say be proactive. I don't know if there are any regulatory people on this call. I hope there is, and I hope that people in regulatory are getting involved and getting informed, and maybe are driving the SmPC and in relation with the JCA assessment. So you know, it's hard to say how to integrate because companies have many different configurations. But I would say if you are in market access, talk to your regulatory people, talk early in the development of the drug. Is there anything I forgot, Nicole?
I muted myself while you were answering. No, I think that's great. That really covers it. And I'm just looking at the time, and we're very close to the end of the webinar. So I just wanted to assure everyone that any questions that come in, we'll definitely answer them afterwards, because I think we're going to run out of time because there's already quite a few questions that have come in. But please just continue to send your questions, and maybe I'll just take a moment to say, please feel free to follow up with Louise and I after this webinar if anything comes to mind, or if you wanted to discuss any kind of specific issues that you might have, we would be happy to follow up with you. So we will send a follow-up email after this webinar to everyone who attended, just to thank everyone for coming, and then you'll have our contact information as well, so that you can connect with us with any further questions. So maybe since we just have like 1 minute left, I'll just take it. There's another question that came in that seems like pretty short to answer. How early in the development process would one start aligning the SmPC with the JCA requirements? That's a good question. I mean, of course, the easy and first thought answer is as early as possible. Of course, like we now have, now that we're only a few weeks away from the first EU JCA assessments starting, we do have, of course, a template which can be reviewed. So you can see clearly what sections are required for the EU JCA and compare them to the sections that are classically required for the SmPC. I would say that, again, early alignment is essential, and ideally starting from the clinical trial planning stage, because really that's where we see the most impact that can be change that can be implemented at that stage to alleviate any challenges down the road. We didn't have an opportunity to get into that as much in this talk, but we have over the years, of course, seen many challenges that have come from clinical trial design that may not align with clinical practice in different countries, or the outcomes may not be recognized by different HTA bodies. These are all things that come up on a regular basis and are issues that we help clients with on a regular basis. But these can, if you go back and start planning at that stage, you can start to look at what you will need down the road. And we're talking quite a few years away. But I would say ideally starting at the clinical trial planning stage, but if not, then as soon after as possible.
Yes, and I would add to that, if you already have an SmPC and it's already underway, there's scenario planning, anticipating the different situations is probably the best way to go. Sit down, evaluate all the scenarios, and it may help quite a bit in your strategy.
Perfect. Thank you, Louise. So anyway, that was the end. We're running out of time, so we'll answer the rest of the questions after via email. And I wanted to thank everyone again for attending. We really appreciated. One of the reasons why this webinar was initiated was because of the interest from Louise's talk at the World Orphan Drug Congress just last week in Barcelona. So we hope that we've gone into a bit of a deeper dive for you, for those that attended that talk and had questions after, as that one was only 15 minutes. This time we got to speak for an hour, so we were able to give a bit more of a deeper dive. If there are questions remaining, please, like I said, get in touch and we'll be happy to follow up. And we hope to see you all again soon on our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.